The black supercar rolled off the flatbed, and the whole shop burst out laughing. Oil wept from the cracked engine block. The front frame had folded inward at an angle no factory ever intended. A junior mechanic lifted the hood, took one look, and walked away shaking his head. Then the foreman stepped forward, crossed his arms, and looked Sandra Holt dead in the eye. "It's beyond repair." Sandra stood beside the wreckage of the most valuable thing she had ever owned, and said nothing. Silk blouse, jaw locked, eyes dry in the way that meant everything underneath was drowning. The room had already moved on. Paperwork, scrapyard quotes, sympathetic shrugs from men who had never loved anything they built. Then from the back corner, a man in a dirty work rag wiped his hand slowly and said something that made every head turn. No one laughed after that. The man nobody noticed was the last one still looking at the car. Everyone else had drifted back to their stations. The laughter had settled into the comfortable murmur of men who had already decided. Clipboards came out. Someone made a call. The foreman was quoting scrapyard rates before Sandra Holt had even taken her second breath. But Joel Mercer stayed where he was in the back corner of the shop, a gray rag hanging from his left hand, his eyes moving slowly across the wreckage, the way a surgeon's eyes move across an X-ray, not looking at the damage, but looking past it. He was 40 years old, and he looked like someone had wrung the youth out of him and hung him up to dry. His hands were calloused in the specific way of a man who worked not because he enjoyed the labor, but because stopping meant thinking. His boots were steel-toed and worn down at the outer heel. He had the posture of someone who had once stood very straight and had slowly over years learned to take up less space. Nobody in that shop knew that Joel had once designed prototype engines for a firm that courted partnerships with 3 of the top manufacturers in the country. Nobody knew about the blueprints he'd drawn at 29 that had made a room full of senior engineers go quiet in a way that meant they were either impressed or threatened, usually both. That version of Joel Mercer existed in a different chapter of a book most people assumed had a bad ending. What they knew was that he showed up on time, kept to himself, and could diagnose an engine fault faster than anyone else on the floor. What they assumed was that he was simply a quiet man with limited ambitions. They had mistaken grief for smallness. Sandra had not moved from the spot where the foreman delivered his verdict. She was 44, and she carried authority the way some people carry a coat. They've worn so long they've forgotten. It's there naturally without effort, and in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She ran the largest luxury automotive group in the country. She had restructured failing divisions, terminated underperforming contracts, and sat across the table from men twice her age who tried to intimidate her and left looking smaller than when they arrived. She was not a woman who lost things. And yet, the car in front of her had started its life as something sacred. Her father, Walter Holt, had spent the last 4 years of his life building it, not as a product, not as an asset, but as the one thing a dying man builds when he wants to leave proof that he existed. A black prototype supercar, one of a kind, never sold, never replicated. The body was Walter's design language at its most refined. The engine was his final attempt to solve a mechanical problem he'd been chasing for decades. Sandra had inherited it the way you inherit the thing a person loved most, with the weight of knowing it meant more than you could fully carry. She had been transporting it to a private exhibition, a small event curated for people who understood what they were looking at, when the truck carrying it was struck from the side on a rain-slicked highway outside of Detroit. The driver walked away with bruised ribs. The car did not walk away at all. Now it sat under the flat fluorescent lights of Holt Performance Garage, which was not named after her family, but had taken the job out of professional courtesies, and every single person in the room had already written it off. Sandra looked at the crumpled hood, the fractured front axle, the engine block with the long diagonal crack running through it like a fault line. She had not cried at her father's funeral. She did not cry now. but something behind her sternum had gone very quiet, the way a room goes quiet after a door slams, and the sound finally stops reverberating. The foreman, a broad man named Russell, with the permanent squint of someone who spent his days in bad lighting, reappeared at her elbow, with a tablet showing photographs of the damage from multiple angles. "I've had 3 of my best guys look at it in the last 20 minutes, Russell said. "The frame is compromised in 4 separate load-bearing sections. The engine block is cracked through the main journal. 2 of the original suspension components don't exist anywhere on the current market. They'd have to be fabricated from scratch, and even then the tolerances on a build like this are so specific that getting it wrong once means starting over." He set the tablet down. "Ms. Holt, I've been doing this for 22 years. I'm not telling you what you want to hear, but I am telling you the truth. It's beyond repair." The words landed with the particular weight of professional certainty. Not cruel, just final. Sandra's advisor, a lean man named Patrick, who had been standing 2 steps behind her since they arrived, leaned in close. "We can have the remnants transported to the design archive. It can still be documented, cataloged. The legacy doesn't have to disappear just because the car—" "Stop talking, Patrick." Patrick stopped talking. Sandra kept her eyes on the car. The fluorescent light caught the one panel that hadn't been damaged, the rear quarter still perfectly black, still showing the subtle compound curve that was entirely her father's invention. She had watched him draw that curve on paper before it ever existed in metal. She had been 11 years old, sitting on a wooden stool in his workshop, eating an apple, and asking questions he always answered seriously. Never the way adults answer children's questions, but the way a man answers someone he respects. She had not thought about that afternoon in years. She thought about it now, and it arrived with the force of something that had been waiting a long time to be felt. That was when she heard it. Not loud, not performed. A voice from the back of the shop that had the specific quality of a man speaking to himself as much as to anyone else. "That engine's not cracked through the journal." Russell turned around. Several mechanics looked up. Sandra turned slowly, and for the first time since the flatbed arrived, the expression on her face was not controlled composure. It was attention. Joel was standing where he had been standing the entire time, still holding the gray rag, but his eyes were no longer on the car. They were on Russell. He said it the way a person says a thing they have already confirmed twice before deciding to say it out loud. The main crack runs parallel to the journal, not through it. Diagonal stress fracture from impact torqued the journal itself is intact, which means the block might still be serviceable if the fracture path doesn't extend to the coolant passages. He finally looked at the car again. "I'd need to get underneath it to be certain." The shop was very still. Russell's jaw tightened in the specific way of a man who has just been corrected in front of a client by someone below him on the organizational chart. "Mercer, the front frame sections, the ones you said were compromised in 4 load-bearing points." Joel moved toward the car without asking permission, crouching near the front left wheel, well pointing without touching. 2 of those 4 points are cosmetic deformation from the bodywork collapsing inward. The actual structural members here and here. He indicated 2 spots in the crumpled metal with a precision that came from knowing exactly what he was looking at. Are bent, not fractured. Bent metal can be straightened. Fractured metal gets replaced. Nobody laughed now. Sandra walked toward him, not quickly, but deliberately in the way she crossed every room, as if she had already decided what she intended to find there. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the places Joel had pointed to, and then she looked at Joel the way you look at someone when you are trying to determine very quickly what category they belong in. "You're saying it can be repaired?" Joel stood up from his crouch. He was not tall, but he was very steady, and he met her eyes without the particular anxiety that most people brought to meeting Sandra Holt's gaze for the first time. "I'm saying it hasn't been evaluated correctly yet." He looked back at the car. "There's a difference Patrick materialized at Sandra's shoulder again. "Ms. Holt, with respect, this shop has already given us their professional assessment. Taking advice from a..." Sandra held up one hand, and Patrick went silent. "What would a correct evaluation require?" she asked. 4 hours, Joel said. "Maybe 5. I need to get the car on a lift, get the engine accessible, and actually measure what's broken versus what's bent versus what's deformed." He turned the rag over in his hands once, not nervously, just the habit of someone who thinks better when his hands are occupied. "And I need to look at the original build specs if you have them. Something this customized, you can't assess it against standard tolerances. You'd have to assess it against what it was designed to be." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the car, at the rear quarter panel with the curve her father drew on paper 30 years ago. Still perfect. Still intact. Still exactly what it had always been. Russell stepped forward. "Ms. Holt, I have to advise against..." "Give him the lift," Sandra said. Russell's mouth closed. "And whatever else he needs," she added, without looking away from the car. Joel nodded, once the small, practical nod of a man receiving instructions he intends to follow precisely, and turned back toward the wreckage with the particular focus of someone who has been waiting all day for permission to do the thing he already knew needed to be done. Patrick pulled Sandra aside and lowered his voice to the register he used when he believed he was preventing a mistake. "You're trusting a shop mechanic over a 22-year veteran with his own facility." "Russell looked at the car for 20 minutes and told me it was dead," Sandra said quietly. "That man has been looking at it since it came off the truck, and he hasn't told me anything except that we don't know enough yet." She watched Joel pull a work light from the wall mount and position it under the chassis. "That's not the same thing." She did not explain further. She had built a company by knowing the difference between a person who told you what they had decided and a person who told you what they had found. That difference was not always obvious, but it was always eventually the most important thing in the room. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and sent a single message to her assistant back at the office. "Delay the transport arrangements. We're not done here yet." Then she leaned against the wall of the shop, crossed her arms, and waited. The evaluation took 6 hours, not 5. Joel worked through the afternoon without stopping, without commentary, without the performance of effort that some men put on when they know they're being watched. He worked the way he always worked, methodically, quietly, each step, following the last, with the logic of someone who had mapped the entire sequence in his head before his hands ever touched the metal. Sandra stayed. Patrick left at hour 2, citing calls that couldn't wait, and Sandra let him go without argument. Russell found reasons to be on the other side of the shop. The other mechanics finished their shifts and clocked out. By early evening, it was just Sandra standing against the far wall, arms crossed, and Joel on his back underneath the chassis, with a work light and a measuring tool, calling out numbers to himself in a low voice. At 6 hours and 12 minutes, Joel rolled out from under the car, sat up on the creeper, and looked at the legal pad balanced on his knee. He had filled 3 pages with notes in handwriting that was precise and very small. "The block is serviceable," he said. "The fracture path stays clear of the coolant passages. The 2 structural frame members I pointed out earlier, both can be straightened with the right press equipment. The front suspension components don't exist on the market, but the original tolerances are reproducible if you have a machinist who knows what they're doing." He looked at the list. "There's significant bodywork damage on the left side that's purely cosmetic at the structural level, and the wiring harness needs to be rebuilt almost entirely. But that's time, not impossibility." Sandra had not moved from the wall. "And the engine," Joel set the legal pad on his knee. "That's the part that takes the longest to answer honestly." He looked at the engine, still sitting in the bay where he'd pulled it under the direct light, every surface visible. "Mechanically, it can be restored to what it was. Every damaged component can be addressed. But your father's original design has a limitation built into it, a fuel delivery timing issue that he never fully resolved. The car could run. It ran before the accident, but it was never running at what he actually intended it to be. Sandra's arms uncrossed slowly. He knew about it, Joel continued. I can see it in how the engine is built. There are 3 different iterations of the same component, like he kept revising and never settled. He was still working on it. He looked at her directly. I can restore it to what it was, or I can try to finish what he started. The shop was very quiet. How long? Sandra asked. To restore it to what it was, 6 weeks is my best estimate, if the machined parts come back clean. Could run longer, depending on what the fabricator finds. Joel looked back at the engine. To finish what he started, that I can't timeline yet. I need more time with the original specs before I understand the full scope of the problem. Could be close to the 6-week mark, could be considerably beyond it. What solution are you thinking about? I need more time with the original specs before I can explain it in a way that would mean anything to you. He said it without condescension, simply as a fact about the current state of his knowledge. But it's there. I can feel where he was trying to go. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Start with the restoration. Show me you can do that first. Then we talk about the rest. Joel nodded and stood up from the creeper. I'll need authorization to order materials and access to whatever original documentation you have on the build. You'll have both by tomorrow morning. She left without saying anything else, and Joel turned back to the engine and the work began in earnest. What followed were weeks that existed outside the normal rhythm of the shop. Joel maintained his regular daytime work, the standard diagnostics and repairs that kept his position at the shop, and kept the modest salary that kept the lights on in the house he and Owen rented on the east side. Then, after the last customer car was returned and the shop officially closed, Joel stayed. Sometimes until midnight, sometimes past it. Owen came with him on the days there was no school the next morning, a 10-year-old with his father's eyes and his mother's habit of asking questions that cut straight to the center of a thing. He did homework at the steel workbench, in the corner pencil, moving steadily across paper, occasionally looking up to hand Joel a tool, without being asked, having learned through months of weekend visits to the shop exactly which wrench went with which motion of his father's hand. The other mechanics had opinions. They expressed them in the particular way of men who work in close quarters, not directly, but sideways, in comments made to each other at a volume calibrated to carry. He'll strip something on that engine and that'll be the end of it, one of them said during a morning shift. Russell said nothing publicly, but he made a point of being present whenever Sandra's advisor Patrick called the shop for updates, and his answers were always carefully non-committal, not optimistic, not encouraging positioned, so that if the project failed, he had not staked anything on it. Patrick called every 4 days. Each time he asked questions designed to introduce doubt about Joel's qualifications, about the timeline, about whether Sandra was making a decision driven by grief rather than judgment. Sandra answered each question with the brevity of someone who has already made the calculation and does not intend to revisit it, the industry noticed. In a world where prototype vehicles and restoration projects were tracked and discussed, the news that Walter Holt's final car had been in an accident traveled fast. What followed was the specific cruelty of a small professional community. Public commentary from people who had not seen the car, had not evaluated the damage, and were not doing the work, but who had strong opinions about all 3. A trade publication ran a short piece under the headline, Holt's Last Prototype End of the Road. 2 senior figures from competing firms were quoted. Both were diplomatic in the way that conveys skepticism while maintaining plausible deniability. One said the damage described sounded categorically irreversible. The other said he admired the sentiment, but that sentiment rarely survived contact with a fractured engine block. Sandra read the piece on a Tuesday morning in her office on the 14th floor of the Holt Group's Detroit headquarters. She set her phone face down on her desk, looked out the window at the city for exactly the amount of time it took her to decide how she felt about it, and then picked the phone back up and sent Joel a message. "Ignore the press. Send me an update when you have one." Joel's reply came 4 hours later, which meant he had read the message immediately and waited until he had something concrete to report. Frame section straightened. Tolerances within spec, moving to the suspension components this week. It was on a Thursday night in the 4th week that Sandra came to the shop unannounced. She had told herself it was a practical visit. She wanted to see the progress directly, rather than through Patrick's filtered reports. That was true as far as it went. What she didn't examine too carefully was the other part, that the shop had become the only place in her current life where something was being built rather than managed. She let herself in through the side entrance she'd been given a key to, and she found the shop dark except for the work area where the car sat, lit from below and above by the portable lights Joel had arranged with the precision of a man who had learned to create good working conditions out of whatever was available. Joel was not working. He was sitting in the driver's seat of the car, or what would become the driver's seat once the interior was restored, currently just a bare metal shell with his forearms resting on the absent steering wheel column, looking at nothing in particular through the frameless windshield opening. Owen was asleep in the corner, curled in the old shop chair that someone had dragged over weeks ago, covered by Joel's work jacket, his homework completed and stacked neatly on the bench beside him. Sandra stood in the doorway for a moment. There was something in the composition of what she was seeing that she didn't have an immediate word for. The sleeping child, and the still man, and the half-rebuilt car under the pool of warm work light, all of it quiet and unhurried, existing at a frequency that had nothing to do with deadlines or reputations, or what anyone outside that room thought about any of it. She had not seen anything that looked like that in a very long time. She walked in and Joel looked up unsurprised. He had heard the door. "I didn't want to wake him," Joel said with a small motion toward Owen. "How long has he been here?" "Since 7. Joel looked at his son for a moment. "He likes the shop. Likes the quiet, I think. At home there's—" He stopped, then started again differently. "It's easier here." Sandra pulled a second stool from the workbench and sat down a few feet from the car. She looked at the engine, now cleaned, and partially reassembled the damaged components, replaced with machined parts that had come back from the fabricator the previous week. Even in its incomplete state, it was a beautiful piece of engineering, the kind of object that communicated intention, that showed the thinking of the mind that had designed it. "You were an engineer," she said. "Not a question." Joel looked at the engine. "I was a lot of things. Prototype work. For a while." He looked at his hands. "I had a firm. Small, but it was doing what I wanted it to do. We had a contract in negotiation that would have changed everything." He stopped. The sentence had an ending he didn't reach. Sandra waited. "My wife got sick." Joel's voice stayed even the flatness of someone who has said this enough times to have built a controlled path through it. "Claire, it moved fast. 14 months from diagnosis to it moved fast. The medical debt was significant. The investors saw the instability and pulled out. You can't blame them. That's how it works." He looked at the engine. By the time everything settled, there was nothing left of the firm. There was Owen. And there was the work. He looked at his hands again. "So I kept doing the work. At someone else's shop." At someone else's shop. He said it without bitterness, but without pretending it was something other than what it was. Sandra looked at the engine for a long time. The piece her father had kept revising. She could see it now that Joel had pointed it out, the 3 iterations of the same component, arranged like a sentence, that had been rewritten and never finished. He used to say that every unsolved problem was just a question you hadn't heard clearly yet, she said. My father. She hadn't intended to say it. It arrived without decision, the way things arrive when you're tired enough to stop guarding the gate. I used to sit in his workshop when I was a child and watch him work. He never explained what he was doing until he'd figured it out. And then, he'd explain the whole thing start to finish, like I'd been following along the entire time. Joel looked at her. I haven't been in a working garage since his funeral, Sandra continued. I manage the company he built. I protect the brand. I make the decisions he would have made if he were still here, or I try to. She looked at her hands. That's not the same thing as understanding why he built things. Joel was quiet for a moment. Then, that piece he kept revising the fuel delivery timing. I think I know what he was trying to do. I think he almost had it. The solution is about 4 steps past where he stopped, but the direction he was going was right. He looked at the engine the way he had looked at it from the first moment, not at the damage, but past it towards the thing it was trying to be. He was close. Sandra looked up. If you want me to finish it, Joel said, I want to finish it. Not because it makes the restoration more impressive, because he was close, and it seems wrong to leave it 4 steps short. Something shifted in Sandra's expression. Not visibly, not in any way that someone standing at a distance would have caught. But it was there, the loosening of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Finish it, she said. Joel nodded. The same small, practical nod as the first day. Outside the city made its nighttime sounds. Owen slept undisturbed in the corner. The half-rebuilt engine sat in the warm light, its unsolved problem exposed and visible, waiting for the next 4 steps. By the 7th week, the story had grown larger than the shop. A journalist from an automotive trade outlet appeared outside one morning, with a camera, having heard enough second-hand details to construct a narrative grieving CEO impossible restoration, anonymous mechanic, the ghost of Walter Holt. It was a good story on its surface. It was also missing every detail that actually mattered. The article that ran 2 days later was not unkind, but it was wrong in the specific way that outside observers are wrong about things they haven't been inside. It described Joel as a local mechanic attempting to restore the Holt prototype against professional consensus. 3 industry figures provided quotes. All 3 expressed polite doubt. One mentioned that the Holt Group's board might have concerns about a project of this profile being managed by someone without verifiable restoration credentials. That last phrase reached Patrick first. He forwarded it to Sandra with a note that said only worth considering. Sandra forwarded it to no one. But at the next board check-in, 2 of her senior directors raised the credentialing point independently, which meant Patrick had raised it with them first. The room had the specific atmosphere of people who had reached a conclusion before the meeting started and were presenting it as spontaneous concern. Joel Mercer has designed prototype engines, Sandra said. He has more relevant experience with this specific category of vehicle than anyone Russell could have put on it. The fact that his career took a difficult turn doesn't change his capability. She looked around the table. We're continuing. The directors exchanged the particular glance of people who have made their objection for the record and intend to make it again later. Sandra drove to the shop that evening, not to check the progress, not for any reason she would have explained to Patrick. She drove to the shop because there was a problem with an unsolved engine in a half-lit garage, and a man who was 4 steps away from finishing something her father had started, and that was against all logic, against the shape her life had taken over the last several years. The most important thing currently happening in her world. She did not know yet that the hardest part was still ahead. What she knew was that the car was more complete than it had been the week before, and Owen had left a small drawing on the workbench, a crayon sketch of the car colored entirely black, with a small figure standing beside it that had Joel's worn boots and a big smile, and that Joel had found it there and set it carefully under the work light where the magnification lamp would hold it flat, and it wouldn't blow away. She did not say anything about the drawing, but she remembered it. The problem revealed itself on a Tuesday night in the 9th week, the way the worst problems always do, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of a door closing. Joel had been working on the fuel delivery timing solution for 3 weeks, by then building on the direction Walter Holt had been moving, taking the 4 steps past where the old man had stopped. The first 2 steps had worked exactly as he'd theorized. The third had required a recalibration that cost him 4 days. But the 4th step, the final connection that would make the whole system function as intended, kept producing the same result, no matter how he approached it. The engine would run. It ran well better than it had before the accident in several measurable ways. But the specific timing sequence that Walter had been chasing, the one that would bring the power delivery curve into alignment with the throttle response, in a way that existed nowhere else in any production or prototype vehicle, that part refused to resolve. Every configuration Joel tested produced a variance that was small by conventional standards and catastrophic by the standards of what this engine was supposed to be. He sat on the shop floor at 11:30 at night, with the test data spread around him on paper, and looked at the numbers, and understood for the first time why Walter Holt had spent 4 years on this problem and still hadn't solved it. It wasn't a manufacturing limitation. It wasn't a materials problem. It was a fundamental tension inside the design itself. The thing the engine was trying to do required 2 mechanical behaviors that worked against each other at the precise moment they needed to work together. Walter had understood this. Joel could see it in the notes Sandra had provided, in the margins of the old man's drawings, phrases that circled the same contradiction from different angles without ever breaking through it. Walter had died with the problem unsolved. Joel stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he turned off the work light and drove home, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, while Owen slept down the hall, and he was more tired than he had been in a very long time. Not in his body, but in the specific place inside a person where belief lives. He had told Sandra he could finish what her father started. He had believed it when he said it. He had believed it through the weeks of restoration work, through the initial testing, through the recalibration that cost him 4 days. He had built the belief carefully, the way you build anything meant to bear weight, and now he was sitting in the dark in his kitchen, wondering if he had miscalculated the load. The thought that arrived next was one he recognized. It had come before, in the months after Claire died, when the firm was dissolving and the debt was still growing, and Owen was 7 years old and asking questions Joel didn't know how to answer. The thought that said, maybe this is simply what the end looks like. He had not surrendered to it then. He had gone to work instead every morning, because Owen needed him to be a person who went to work. The work had kept him functional when nothing else could. He sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Then he went to bed. And the next day, he went back to the shop because that was the only answer he had ever found that was worth anything. He spent 3 days dismantling his own solution, not the restoration that was complete solid, every component, either restored or replaced to tolerances that met or exceeded the original spec. He dismantled only the timing work, laying each element out on the bench, in sequence, looking at the system the way he had looked at the wrecked car on the first day. Not at what it was, but past it, toward what it was trying to become. On the second day, Owen sat beside him after school and watched him stare at the components in silence for nearly an hour. "Is it broken?" Owen asked. "No," Joel said. "It does exactly what it's built to do. That's the problem." Owen considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "So you have to build it to do something different." Joel looked at his son. It was not a revelation. The thought had been present in various forms for days. But there is a difference between a thought that lives in the background and a thought that gets said out loud by a 10-year-old, in the plain language of someone who has not yet learned to be intimidated by complexity. Build it to do something different. Not fix the tension between the 2 mechanical behaviors. Not find the configuration that made them cooperate. Change what one of them was. Joel picked up the component he had been staring at and turned it over in his hands. The tension in the system existed because both elements were trying to do their full job at the same moment. What if one of them did a different job, a smaller job, a preparatory job, so that the other could do the thing that mattered at the moment? It mattered. It would mean redesigning a component that Walter had never redesigned. It would mean departing from the original architecture in a way that was no longer restoration, but invention. It would mean building something that had Walter Holt's vision in it, but Joel Mercer's solution. He set the component down carefully. "Go do your homework," he told Owen. Owen went. Joel picked up a pencil and the legal pad and started writing, and he did not stop until the shop went completely cold around him, and he realized he had been working for 4 hours without noticing the time. The solution took 11 days to build and test. The component he redesigned was small, a staging element in the fuel delivery sequence, changed from a direct response function to a preload function that set conditions 1 beat ahead of the moment the main timing event needed them. The change was precise enough that it altered nothing visible about the engine's external architecture. But internally, the tension that had resisted every other approach simply ceased to exist. The two behaviors that had been working against each other were no longer asked to occupy the same moment. On the 8th day of testing, the power delivery curve came into alignment with the throttle response for the first time. Joel sat very still and looked at the data. Then he ran the test again, and again, and a 4th time, changing one variable slightly each iteration to confirm the result was stable and not a coincidence of conditions. It was stable. He called Sandra at 7:45 in the morning. She picked up before the second ring had finished. "It works," he said. There was a moment on her end, the quality of air in a room when something has just shifted. Then Sandra said, "I'll clear my morning. I'll be there by 9. She walked in at 8:57. Joel had the engine running when she arrived, not at full load but at the idle, that allowed the timing sequence to be heard and felt, rather than just read off a gauge. The sound was different from any engine Sandra had been near in her professional life. It was smoother than it should have been, with an evenness to the power delivery that resolved into the throttle, like something breathing rather than something firing. Sandra stood beside the car and put her hand on the fender and felt it. Joel watched her. He had learned over the weeks how to read the small register of her reactions, the things she expressed in posture and stillness rather than words. "He never heard it run like this," she said. "No," Joel said. But he knew it was possible. Everything in his original design was pointed toward this. He just needed one more step. Sandra took her hand off the fender and looked at Joel directly. "You changed a component?" "The staging element in the fuel delivery sequence. The external architecture is unchanged. Everything your father designed is still there. He considered the word carefully, completed the sentence. Sandra looked at the engine running in the car that had been declared beyond repair 11 weeks ago in this same shop by men who were not wrong about what they saw, but were wrong about what it meant. "The launch is in 2 weeks, she said. "The exhibition we originally planned, I had it rescheduled. Press, industry figures, people who knew my father." She looked at Joel. "I want you there." "I'm not," Joel started. "Not optional," Sandra said, not harshly, just as a fact about how this was going to go. Joel closed his mouth and nodded. The 2 weeks before the launch were the loudest the project had been. The trade press had been tracking the story since the article in the 7th week, and as the exhibition date became known, the coverage accelerated. Most of it was framed as a question: could the restoration actually be real, or was this a carefully managed piece of brand mythology? The 3 industry figures who had expressed doubt earlier were quoted again. One of them had upgraded his position slightly, allowing that if the claims about the engine work were accurate, it would be a significant technical achievement. The other 2 remained skeptical in the diplomatic way that protects a person from being wrong on record. Patrick sent Sandra a media briefing document that recommended limiting Joel's visibility at the launched event. The language was careful, managing the narrative, controlling the technical spokesperson, but the meaning was plain. Sandra read the document, once set it aside, and did not respond to it. On the night before the launch, Sandra drove to the shop one last time. The car was finished, fully finished, not a single element outstanding, sitting under a cloth cover in the center of the shop floor. Joel was there, not working, just present the way he had been present on the night she first found him sitting in the bare metal shell of the driver's seat. "Tomorrow's going to be loud," Sandra said. "I know." Joel looked at the covered car. "I've been thinking about what you said, about managing the company your father built, making the decisions he would have made." Sandra waited. "I don't think that's what you've been doing," Joel said. "Not on this project." He looked at her. "He would have made the same call you made, probably. But you made it for your own reasons. You looked at that car, and you decided it was worth fighting for, based on what you saw, not based on what he would have wanted." He looked back at the covered car. "That's different. That matters." Sandra held his gaze for a moment. The thing that had been loosening in her, since the night she found Owen asleep in the corner, had over the weeks reached something structural, something load-bearing that she had not realized was locked until it wasn't anymore. "Get some sleep," she said. "You should look like someone who just did the thing he actually did." Joel almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it. The exhibition hall held 140 people, which was small by industry standards, and exactly right for what this was. Press collectors, engineers, a handful of people who had worked alongside Walter Holt at various points in his career, and were present not as industry representatives, but as people who had known him personally. Among them was Frank Daly, an engineer in his late 60s, who had collaborated with Walter during the early years of the Holt Group, back when the company was still small enough that every person in it knew what everyone else was building. He had flown in from Phoenix the previous evening and had not told anyone he was coming. The cloth-covered car sat on a low platform at the center of the room, under warm directional lighting. Sandra stood to one side of the platform. Joel stood 2 steps behind her, and to the right in the same position he had occupied, in that shop from the very first day present, watchful, taking up exactly the space required, and no more. Patrick was there. Russell was there in the back, which was a choice that communicated something about his professionalism, even if it communicated nothing warmer than that. Sandra spoke first. She did not use notes. She talked about her father, not the biography, not the professional legacy, but the specific texture of the man. The way he answered a child's question seriously. The wooden stool in his workshop. The drawings that preceded the metal by months. She talked about the accident, and about arriving at the shop expecting to hear that the last thing he built was gone, and about a man in the back corner of the shop who had looked at the same wreckage as everyone else and seen something different. She did not editorialize. She simply described what had happened, in the order it had happened. Then she nodded to the 2 technicians at the corners of the platform, and the cloth came down. The room went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next cue. The genuine quiet of people encountering something that stops the need for commentary. The car was perfect, not in the restored to original sense, but in the sense of a thing that has arrived at exactly what it was always meant to be. The bodywork was flawless. The lines were Walter Holt's, unmistakably that compound curve on the rear quarter, as distinctive as a signature. And when Sandra nodded again, and Joel leaned in and started the engine from the platform, the sound that filled the room was the one he had heard for the first time 11 days ago. That particular smoothness, that evenness, the power delivering itself like something breathing. Several of the people who had known Walter Holt personally stood up straighter. Frank Daly pressed his hand flat against his sternum and held it there. His eyes fixed on the car, with the expression of a man hearing a piece of music he had been told would never be performed. Sandra turned to the room and said, "Joel Mercer didn't restore this car to what it was. He restored it to what it was designed to be. Those are not the same thing. Walter Holt spent 4 years working toward a solution he didn't live to complete. Joel found it." She looked at Joel directly. "And he found it working nights in someone else's shop while raising his son alone." The room was still quiet. Then Frank Daly started the applause, and it spread, and it was the kind of applause that carries weight because it comes from people who understand, specifically, what they are applauding. Joel stood in it with the stillness of someone who has not fully processed yet what is happening to them. His hands were at his sides. He was wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, dark pants, a gray shirt, no tie, and he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had built something real, standing next to the evidence of it. Sandra let the moment hold. Then she spoke again. I'm announcing today the formation of a new division within the Holt Group, a dedicated restoration and prototype development department for vehicles of historic and technical significance. She looked at the room and then back at Joel. I've asked Joel Mercer to lead it. He has agreed. She let one more beat land before delivering the last part. The division will be named the Walter Holt and Claire Mercer Workshop. The applause came again louder, and this time Joel's stillness broke. Not dramatically, not visibly to most of the room, but Sandra was close enough to see it. The single controlled exhale of a man who has been holding something tightly for a very long time, and has just been told he can set it down. He did not cry. He was not that kind of man, or had learned not to be. But his jaw moved once, and he looked at the floor for exactly the moment required to collect himself, and then he looked up. The engine was still running behind them. Walter Holt's timing sequence finally resolved cycling through its revolutions with the patience of a thing that has been waiting years to work correctly, and is now simply steadily doing what it was built to do. Later, after the press had their photographs, after Frank Daly had spent 20 minutes with Joel, talking through the technical solution in the specific delighted language of engineers who have found each other after Patrick had shaken Joel's hand, with the careful professionalism of a man recalibrating his position. Sandra found Joel standing near the rear of the exhibition hall, looking at the city lights through the tall glass. Owen was there. Sandra had arranged for him to attend the latter half of the event, and he was standing beside his father with his hands in his pockets, watching the room with the quiet observational quality he shared with Joel, and that was entirely his own at the same time. Is this where you work now? Owen asked Sandra. Not exactly, Sandra said. But your father does. Owen considered this and looked up at Joel. Is it better than the old shop? Joel looked at his son, then at the car on the platform, then at the city outside, the glass lit up in the specific way Detroit lit up at night. Not elegant, not glamorous, but persistent. The light of a place that had been counted out before and had simply kept going. Yeah, Joel said. It's better. Owen nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the room. Sandra stood beside them and did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said. The car was whole. The engine was running. The problem that had gone unsolved for 4 years had its answer. And two people who had been broken in different ways, by different losses at different times, stood in a warm room full of people who had just watched something impossible become real and breathed and let the night be what it was.